The grocery store on Burrard Street smelled like floor cleaner and overripe bananas. The kind of smell that clings to your coat long after you've left. It was the sort of Tuesday afternoon in November when the sky over Vancouver had already gone dark by 4 o'clock, and the rain came down so steadily that people stopped noticing it altogether. Most of the shoppers that day moved through the aisles with purpose, grabbing what they needed, checking their phones, rushing back to warm cars and warmer kitchens. Nobody was lingering. Nobody except Dorothea Haynes. She stood in the baking aisle, with a red plastic basket hanging from her left arm and a worn leather wallet open in her right hand. She was 38 years old, though the last 2 years had added something to her face that didn't quite belong to her age. A particular kind of tiredness that settles in around the eyes when life has been asking more than it gives. Her dark hair was pulled back under a gray toque, and her coat, a navy parka that had seen 4 Canadian winters, had a small tear along the left pocket she kept meaning to sew. She had her 7-year-old son, Miles, balanced on her hip, even though he was probably too old to be carried that way. But he'd fallen asleep in the car, and she hadn't wanted to wake him completely, and now he rested against her shoulder with his eyes half open, clutching a small dinosaur toy he'd refused to leave behind. In her wallet she had $14.30. She counted it twice, the way people do when they already know the number, but hope the act of counting will somehow change it. It did not change. Dorothea had been doing the mental arithmetic since she'd left the apartment. Bread $2.49, peanut butter $3.89 on sale. A bag of apples because Miles wouldn't eat the lunch she packed unless there was an apple in it. That was his rule. A child's arbitrary rule she had stopped fighting, because some battles cost more energy than they're worth. That came to roughly $8, which left $6.30. And then there was the matter of the flour and the baking powder sitting on the shelf in front of her. Thursday was Miles's birthday. He was turning 8, and for the last 3 years, since his father had left and Dorothea had moved them from Calgary to Vancouver to be closer to her sister, who had then moved to Halifax 8 months later, because life had a sense of humor. Miles had asked for one thing for his birthday. Not a toy, not a video game, not a party with friends from school, though she knew he wanted that too, and had not asked because, somewhere in his 7-year-old heart he understood that some of the things couldn't be asked for. He had asked for a chocolate cake, with sprinkles, made by her, not from a box. The kind you made that one time, he'd said, very seriously, the week before. With the real frosting that tastes like chocolate and not like plastic. She had laughed at that, at the part about plastic frosting, and he had laughed too because he liked making her laugh. But she had gone to bed that night, with a knot in her chest, knowing that the flour and cocoa and good butter and the block of real chocolate she'd need would come to nearly $12. And $12 was not a number she had access to right now. Not with the hydro bill coming and the daycare invoice she was already 2 weeks late on. She stood in the baking aisle and looked at the flour. A 2-kilogram bag, $4.90. She picked it up, put it in the basket, then stood very still for a moment. Miles stirred against her shoulder. "Mama," he murmured, without opening his eyes all the way. "I know, Bug," she said quietly. "Almost done." She calculated again. If she put back the apples, if she bought the store-brand bread instead of the one Miles preferred, if she skipped the baking powder and used what she thought, she was not certain, might still be in the cupboard at home. If she did all of that, she could get the flour and the cocoa, and still have enough for the bread and the peanut butter. It was the kind of math that people who have never had to do it don't understand. Not difficult math. Precise math. The kind where every number matters and there is no margin for error and you hold all of it in your head, because writing it down makes it feel more real than you can bear. She put the apples back. Then she picked up the cocoa powder, checked the price, put it back, picked up the store-brand version, 2 shelves down, checked that price, put it in the basket. She was so focused on the numbers in her head that she didn't notice the man, who had been standing at the end of the aisle for the last 2 minutes, pretending to read the label on a bag of oats. His name was Graham Sutherland, and he was 41 years old and a single father of twin girls, Hazel and June, though June went by her middle name, Bex, because she had decided at age 5 that June sounded like a month and she was not a month. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the particular kind of face that looks serious until it breaks into a smile, at which point it becomes the face of someone who has spent a lot of time finding things funny. He had a full cart beside him. He shopped on Tuesdays because the store was quieter, had done this for 2 years now, ever since his ex-wife Renata had moved to Edmonton. And he'd had to figure out at 39 how to feed 2 8-year-olds. On a budget that left very little room for learning curves. He had gotten good at the math too. He understood what he was watching. He wasn't staring, he was just aware. The way you become aware of someone, when something about them reminds you of yourself, a version of yourself you remember clearly and don't miss, but also haven't entirely forgotten. He watched Dorothea put the apples back. He watched her stand for a moment, with her eyes closed, just briefly. The way you close your eyes when you're doing arithmetic in your head, and need to block out everything else. He watched her shift her sleeping son higher on her hip without thinking about it, the automatic adjustment of a parent carrying weight they've learned to carry. Then he looked away, because it felt it wrong to keep watching. He turned his cart and moved toward the next aisle. And then he stopped. The thing about moments where you could do something is that they pass very quickly. There's a narrow window, maybe 30 seconds, where the action is still possible and natural. And after that it becomes awkward, or strange, or too late. Graham had let those windows close before. Most people had. It's not cruelty. It's just that the moment passes faster than the decision forms. He turned the cart back around. He walked to the produce section, picked up a bag of apples, the same kind Dorothea had put back. He'd seen the label, and then went to the baking aisle, where she was now comparing 2 different sizes of baking powder. "Excuse me," he said. Dorothea looked up. There was a brief flash of something across her face. The particular wariness of someone who is used to being approached in public with bad news, or requests, or complications. Then it smoothed out into the polite expression of someone waiting to hear what came next. "Sorry to bother you," Graham said, and his voice was quieter than his size suggested, genuinely apologetic. "I know this is a bit odd, but I grabbed too many of these by accident." He held up the bag of apples. "I already have some at home, would you want them? I'd just have to put them back otherwise." Dorothea looked at the apples, then at him. Miles lifted his head from her shoulder and looked at the apples too with the direct, unfiltered interest of a tired child, encountering something unexpected. "Those are apples," Miles said. "They are," Graham agreed, very seriously. "Good ones I think, probably." Miles considered this. "We like apples." "Miles," Dorothea said softly. Then, to Graham, "That's kind of you. But you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Graham said. He set the apples down on the shelf beside her rather than pressing them toward her, which somehow made it feel less like charity and more like an offer. "But I'll just be returning them otherwise, and the line up front is brutal on Tuesdays." There was a pause. A small one. The kind of pause where someone decides whether to let something in. "Okay," Dorothea said. "Thank you." She picked up the apples and put them in her basket. Graham nodded once, the way people nod when a thing has been handled without fuss, which is the best outcome for everyone. He started to turn away. And then, because Hazel and Bex had made him a birthday cake last year from scratch. Flour everywhere, frosting on the ceilings somehow. And it had been the best cake he had ever eaten in his life. And he knew what it meant to make a real cake for someone who was counting on it. He paused. "Are you making a birthday cake?" he asked. He nodded toward her basket. "The flour, the cocoa, the baking powder." It was a reasonable inference. Dorothea blinked. "My son's turning 8 on Thursday. 8 is a good one," Graham said. He glanced at Miles, who was now more awake and watching him with the serious evaluation that children apply to strangers they haven't decided about yet. "My girls just turned 8 in September. Chaos, but good chaos." "Girls plural?" "Twins," he said, with the expression of a man who has spent 8 years answering follow-up questions about this. "Yeah." Despite everything, the wallet with $14, the tight math, the hydro bill, the gray November rain, Dorothea smiled. It was a small smile, but real. "Chocolate cake?" Graham asked. With sprinkles, Miles confirmed from her shoulder, now apparently fully invested in this conversation. Graham looked at the basket again. He could see what was there. He could also see what wasn't there. No butter, no real chocolate, just cocoa powder, and he knew from experience that the difference between cocoa powder frosting and real chocolate frosting was the difference between a cake and a great cake, and Miles had asked for great. He didn't say any of that. Instead he said, "I think I have too much butter in my cart. The girls and I have been on a bit of a baking kick and I went overboard at Costco. You'd be doing me a favor, honestly." It wasn't entirely true. It was in fact, not true at all, but it was said gently and with the conviction of someone who had decided that kindness, sometimes, wears the clothes of a white lie. Dorothea looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to do that," she said again. "I know," he said again. And then, more quietly, "But I'd like to." There was something in his voice when he said it. Not pity, which she would have felt immediately and recoiled from, but something more like recognition. The tone of someone who has stood in a similar aisle, done similar math, and been grateful when a small thing went unexpectedly right. She didn't answer right away. She shifted Miles on her hip and looked down at the basket, and Graham waited, because he understood that accepting help when you're not used to it takes a moment. The same way your eyes need time to adjust when you step from a dark room into light. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you. Really." They ended up at the baking section for another few minutes. Graham knew where the good chocolate was. The baking chocolate, not the stuff in the candy aisle. And he pointed it out. And somehow, they fell into a conversation about birthday cakes that felt oddly comfortable. Two parents standing in a grocery store aisle in the rain-gray late afternoon, talking about sprinkles and frosting, and the particular challenge of making something from scratch when you're tired and short on time, but don't want to let your kid down. Miles had fully woken up by now, and had decided that Graham was acceptable. He showed him the dinosaur. Graham identified it correctly as a Parasaurolophus, which Miles found deeply impressive, and said so without reservation. "My daughters have a bin of them at home," Graham said. "I've had to become an expert." "I have 14, Miles said, "but 3 of them are broken." "The broken ones still count," Graham said. Miles thought about this and nodded. As though this were a philosophical position he was willing to endorse. At the checkout, Graham went to a different register. He didn't make a production of it. Before he turned away he said, simply, "Happy early birthday to the dinosaur expert." Miles grinned, the full uncomplicated grin of a child who has received a compliment he agrees with entirely. Dorothea watched him go. She stood at the register and loaded her items onto the belt, and the cashier scanned them. And when the total came up it was $11.12, which was $3.18 less than she had. And she exhaled very quietly in a way that Miles didn't notice. She carried him out to the car through the rain, buckled him in, and sat in the front seat for a moment before starting the engine. "Mama," Miles said from the back seat. "Yeah, Bug, that man knew about Parasaurolophus." "He did. Most grown-ups don't know about Parasaurolophus." "I know." A pause. The rain on the windshield. "He was nice," Miles said simply. "Yeah," Dorothea said. "He was." She thought about Graham as she drove home, not in any particular way, just the way you think about an unexpected thing that happened, turning it over lightly. She thought about how he hadn't made a show of it. How he'd framed everything as his problem, his extra apples, his too much butter from Costco, his grocery error. So that she could accept without feeling diminished. She had spent 2 years fending off pity, the particular suffocating pity that people offer single mothers, as though the category itself is a tragedy. Graham hadn't offered pity. He'd offered company, briefly, in the middle of an aisle, and then apples. It was, she thought, a remarkably decent thing to have done. She didn't expect to see him again. She made the cake on Wednesday night after Miles was asleep. The apartment was quiet in the particular way that apartments get quiet after 8 o'clock when you're a parent. The active, alert quiet of someone who has 20 minutes before exhaustion takes over and knows it. She measured out the flour and the cocoa and the baking powder, and found to her relief that there was indeed still baking powder in the cupboard, nearly a full can of it. So she put the new one aside for later. She used the butter Graham had pressed on her, and the chocolate he'd pointed to, and she made the batter from scratch, the real way, the way her own mother had taught her, on a Sunday afternoon in Saskatoon when she was 12 years old. Standing on a step stool to reach the counter, she thought about her mother while she stirred the batter, then she stopped thinking about her. Because that was a road that led somewhere she couldn't afford to go on a Wednesday night. The cake came out right, not perfect. One layer was slightly thicker than the other, but right in the way that mattered, which was that it smelled like chocolate and warmth and the particular kind of love that goes into something made by hand. She made the frosting from the good chocolate, which melted into the butter in a way that made the kitchen smell almost indecently good. And she had to stop herself from tasting it too many times. She added the sprinkles last. Miles had specified that the sprinkles should be everywhere, not just on top, so she pressed them into the sides as well, which was fiddly, and resulted in sprinkles on the floor and in her hair, and on the dish towel she'd hung over her shoulder. She didn't mind. She stood back and looked at the cake and felt something loosen in her chest. Something she hadn't realized was tight. She took a photo on her phone. Not to post anywhere, she didn't really use social media anymore, hadn't for over a year, but just to have. Thursday morning, Miles came into the kitchen and saw the cake on the counter and stopped walking. He stood very still for a moment, the way children go still when something exceeds expectation. Then he turned to look at his mother, and his face was doing several things at once. "You made it," he said. It wasn't quite surprise, but it was close. "I made it," Dorothea confirmed. She was holding her coffee mug with both hands and watching him. "With real frosting. Not plastic." Miles walked over and inspected it very seriously, leaning forward with his hands clasped behind his back, the way he did when he was studying something important. He looked at the sides where the sprinkles were. He looked at the top. He straightened up. "It has sprinkles on the sides," he said. "Everywhere," Dorothea said. As requested. He launched himself at her then. The full body hug of a child with no self-consciousness about force or momentum. And she caught him and held on, her coffee mug somehow miraculously not spilling, and pressed her face against the top of his head. "Happy birthday, Bug," she said. He was quiet for a moment against her shoulder, then muffled, "Best birthday." "It's 7 in the morning," she said. "It hasn't really started yet." "Doesn't matter," he said, still muffled. "Best birthday." She laughed. She couldn't help it. It was Hazel who found them, technically. Or rather, Hazel was the one who noticed. The following Saturday, Dorothea had taken Miles to Trout Lake, because he'd asked to feed the geese, and she tried to always say yes to requests that cost nothing and involved fresh air. It was cold. Properly cold now, the kind of cold that felt like December even though it was still November. And the park was mostly empty, just a few dog walkers moving quickly along the path, their breath visible in the air. Miles was at the edge of the water, offering bread crusts to a goose, with the intense, diplomatic focus of a child who has not yet learned that geese are not interested in diplomacy. Dorothea stood a few meters back, her hands in her pockets, watching him. "He's very committed to that negotiation," said a voice beside her. She turned. Graham Sutherland was standing there in a dark green jacket, hands also in pockets, watching Miles and the goose with an expression of genuine interest. Beside him were 2 girls, both wearing matching orange hats. Not identical girls, she would learn later. Quite different in temperament and build, but today in their matching hats they could have been a set. The one on the left was watching Miles with open curiosity. The one on the right was watching the goose with what appeared to be competitive assessment. "The goose is not interested," Dorothea said. "The goose is never interested," Graham agreed. "That's the thing about geese. They have a whole attitude." Miles looked over and saw him and did an almost comical double take. "You're the Parasaurolophus man," he announced. "I am," Graham said gravely. "That is now my official title." The girl on the left, this was Hazel, though Dorothea didn't know that yet, stepped forward. "What's a Parasaurolophus?" she asked Miles directly, with no preamble, the way children address each other. Miles's expression shifted into the focused enthusiasms of someone who has been waiting his whole life to be asked this question by a peer. He began explaining. The goose was temporarily forgotten. Within 3 minutes. Miles and Hazel were crouched at the edge of the water, with Miles drawing something in the frost, on a nearby bench with his finger, and Hazel was watching, with the particular attention of someone who is genuinely interested, and not pretending. The girl with the competitive goose assessment. Bex, Dorothea would learn, had by this point concluded something about the goose and turned her attention elsewhere. Graham and Dorothea stood side by side watching their respective children for a moment. "How was the cake?" he asked. She looked at him. "You remembered, Thursday," he said. 8 years old, chocolate with sprinkles, it's a hard itinerary to forget. She thought about Miles's face that morning, the stillness before the hug. "It was good," she said, "really good." He stood in front of it like it was something at a museum. Graham smiled. It was the smile she had seen briefly in the grocery store, the one that changed his face entirely. "That's the best review a cake can get," he said. "Better than any Yelp review." She laughed, which surprised her. Not because she'd forgotten how to laugh, but because she hadn't expected to do it so easily with someone she had met once, briefly. In a grocery store in the rain. They talked while their children negotiated the complex social terrain of new friendship, which Miles and Hazel seemed to be managing successfully, and which Bex was participating in on her own terms, having now recruited both of them into some enterprise involving a stick and a specific patch of gravel that Dorothea couldn't follow from a distance. She learned that Graham worked in project management for a mid-sized construction firm, that he'd been in Vancouver for 6 years, that he lived about 12 blocks from Trout Lake and came here on Saturday mornings, because the girls liked the geese even though. He said this gravely. The geese were terrible, and always had been. She told him she worked at a legal aid clinic on the east side, administrative work, scheduling and intake, that it didn't pay particularly well, but she'd been there 3 years, and they were flexible about pickup times, which mattered more to her right now than salary. She told him Miles had started grade 2 in September and had taken to it with a focus that was both gratifying and slightly alarming. The way very committed 8-year-olds can be alarming in their intensity. She didn't tell him about Calgary, or her ex, or her sister in Halifax, or the hydro bill. Some things you carry until you choose to set them down, and she hadn't chosen yet. But she told him about Saskatoon, and her mother's kitchen, and how she'd learned to make chocolate cake on a step stool at age 12. And he told her about his own kitchen disasters. The time he'd made pancakes for the girls and somehow, to this day, he could not explain how, set the dish towel on fire, and by the time Miles came running over to report that Hazel knew the names of 7 different dinosaurs already, and was very smart, and probably could be a paleontologist. Dorothea realized they had been talking for nearly 40 minutes without noticing. Graham crouched down to Miles's level. 7 is pretty good, he said. Hazel's never had a good teacher before. Miles looked at Hazel, who had arrived beside him. You can borrow my book, Miles told her with great seriousness. It has all of them, even the ones with weird names. Hazel, who had the focused demeanor of a child who takes all commitments seriously, nodded. Okay, she said, that would be good. Bex, who had rejoined the group, looked at Miles and said, do you know how to skip stones? Miles did not know how to skip stones. He said so. I'll show you, Bex said, already moving toward the water with the confidence of someone who has decided, this is happening. Graham and Dorothea exchanged a look. The kind of look 2 parents exchange when their children have made a social decision that is moving faster than the adults were prepared for. Is this okay? Graham asked. Not about the stone skipping, about all of it, the easy shorthand of the question. Yeah, Dorothea said, this is okay. They started getting coffee on Sundays. It wasn't planned. The first time, Graham texted to say he was walking past the cafe on Kingsway that had the good almond croissants and asking if she wanted one. And she was 2 blocks away anyway, so she came. And they sat for an hour while the girls colored on the kids' menu. And Miles told Hazel a great deal about dinosaurs with the dedicated urgency of someone running out of time. Which he was not, he simply spoke that way. The second Sunday was planned. And then it became a thing they did. She told him about Calgary in pieces, over several Sundays. Not all at once. She wasn't built for all at once, but in the way that things come out when you've been sitting with someone long enough that talking becomes easier than not. The marriage that had been wrong from the beginning. But she hadn't been able to see it clearly until it was over. The process of leaving, which had been less dramatic than she'd feared, and more exhausting than she'd imagined. The move to Vancouver, which had been her idea, the one place she knew where she might be able to start something that looked like a life. The sister leaving for Halifax 8 months later. The way she'd been angrier about that than she'd admitted to anyone, including herself. Graham listened in the way that people who have actually been through hard things listen. Without offering solutions, without minimizing, just with the steadiness of someone who knows that the point is to be heard, not fixed. He told her about Renata too. Not with anger, the anger had run its course years earlier. But with the particular clarity of someone who has processed something down to the facts. The marriage had ended because they had become 2 people who wanted different things, and had been too stubborn to admit it until there was nothing left to save. The custody arrangement worked, mostly. The girls had adjusted, the way resilient children adjust, carrying more than they showed and asking less than they needed, and he tried every day to close that gap. Bex cried for 3 weeks when Renata moved to Edmonton. He said one Sunday, his coffee going cold. She didn't tell me for a month, Hazel told me. That's just who they are. Bex holds it in until it comes out sideways. Hazel says the thing directly. Miles holds it in, Dorothea said. He thinks he's protecting me. He's 7. 8, she said. As of last Thursday. Officially 8. 8-year-olds shouldn't have to protect anyone, Graham said. No, she agreed. They shouldn't. They sat with that for a moment. Outside the cafe window, the rain had started again in the unhurried way Vancouver rain often did, as though it had all the time in the world. Miles and Hazel were deep in a conversation at the other end of the table that seemed to involve a complex map Hazel had drawn on a paper napkin. Bex was doing something with a straw that Graham seemed to have decided not to investigate. Can I ask you something? Graham said. Sure. That day in the grocery store. The Tuesday before his birthday. He paused. Were you okay? It was a direct question. She hadn't expected directness, which was strange, because she had already understood that he was a direct person. Maybe she'd expected him to approach it sideways, to be diplomatic about it, to use the comfortable indirectness that people use when they're asking about something private. He hadn't. He'd just asked. No, she said. Not entirely, he nodded, not with pity. With the acknowledgement of someone who has been asked the same question and given the same answer. I figured, he said. I didn't want to overstep that day. I wasn't sure if I'd gotten it right. You got it right, she said, the way you did it. Framing it as your problem, your extra apples. It made it possible to say yes. He was quiet for a moment. I had someone do something similar for me once, he said. About 2 years after Renata left. I was at a hardware store, of all places, and I was trying to fix something in the apartment and I'd already bought the wrong thing twice and I was just exhausted. The kind of exhausted that isn't really about being tired. He paused. There was an older guy who worked there, maybe 60, and he just started helping me without making it feel like help. He walked me through the whole thing, found the right parts, explained what I needed to do, spent probably 45 minutes with me when he didn't have to. Never made me feel stupid. Never made me feel like a project. Did it work? Dorothea asked. The repair? Graham's face shifted into the smile. Absolutely not, he said. I had to call a plumber. But that's not really the point. She laughed. Miles looked up from the map across the table and grinned reflexively. The way children grin when their mother laughs, even without knowing the reason. No, she agreed. It's not the point. March came, and with it the particular Vancouver spring that wasn't quite spring yet, but had lost the hard edge of winter. The cherry blossoms appearing cautiously on the trees along the side streets. The days stretching out in small increments that felt significant after months of 4 o'clock dark. Dorothea applied for a position she'd been looking at since January. A coordinator role, at a family services organization. A step up from what she was doing now. With better pay and benefits, and a mandate she actually believed in. She'd been sitting on the application because there were 12 reasons not to. And she'd been letting them accumulate. Graham, when she mentioned it, was direct about that too. Those aren't reasons, he said. Those are anxiety wearing a suit. She sent the application that night. She got an interview, and then a second interview. And then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March, a phone call, while she was picking Miles up from school. She took the call in the school parking lot, standing outside the car with Miles sitting on the hood, eating a granola bar with complete calm, because she'd told him she needed a minute, and he'd accepted this without question. She hung up and stood for a moment with the phone in her hand. Mama, Miles said. I got a new job, she said. Miles put down the granola bar. He looked at her with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered. Is that good? Yes, she said. That's very good. He slid off the hood and put his arms around her waist, granola bar still in hand, and pressed his face against her jacket in the abbreviated matter-of-fact way he showed affection. Not showy, just real, there and then gone. Good, he said into her jacket. Then he got in the car. She texted Graham from the parking lot. 3 words. I got it. His reply came back in under a minute. I knew you would. Hazel wants to know if Miles is available for a very important paleontology summit this weekend. She sat in the car and smiled at her phone for longer than was probably necessary. The birthday cake, it turned out, became a tradition. Not just for Miles. The following September, when Hazel and Bex turned 9, Dorothea made them a cake together with Graham in his kitchen. A double-layer vanilla cake for Hazel, who had decided she actually preferred vanilla after a thorough period of research, and a lemon cake with lemon frosting for Bex, who wanted something that tastes like a strong opinion, which was, Graham said, the most accurate description of Bex's general preference in everything. The kitchen was chaotic. Flour on the counter. Someone's elbow in the frosting. Miles and Hazel, conducting an experiment in the corner, involving sprinkles and a ruler that neither adult asked about. Bex eating lemon zest directly from the grater, with a focused, meditative expression. It was the kind of chaos that fills a kitchen with warmth. Miles, who had recently turned 9 himself, surveyed the situation from his corner and said to Hazel, My mom makes good cake, I know, Hazel said. She's teaching my dad. He's not bad, Miles said diplomatically. He lowered his voice. He put in too much vanilla last time. Don't tell him. Dorothea, across the kitchen, caught Graham's eye. He'd heard. She knew by the way his mouth was fighting to be serious and losing. She had stood in a grocery store aisle in November with $14 and a sleeping child on her hip, and all the weariness of 2 years pressed into her face, and she had let a stranger hand her apples. And that small act of grace, unhurried, unshowy, given without the weight of expectation, had been the beginning of something she hadn't known she was missing. Not rescued, not fixed. Just seen, recognized, briefly, by someone who understood the math. Everything else had followed from that. Her own work, her own choices, her own stubborn daily effort to build something that would hold. But kindness, she thought now, standing in Graham's too-warm kitchen with flour on her sleeve and Miles telling Hazel a borderline inaccurate fact about the Cretaceous period, is sometimes what makes the next thing possible. Not the whole answer. Just the hinge. Bex appeared at her elbow. She was 9 years old and the most direct person Dorothea had ever met in any age category. Is this cake going to be good? Bex asked. Yes, Dorothea said. How do you know? Because we made it, she said. That always counts for something. Bex evaluated this answer. Apparently finding it satisfactory, she turned back to the lemon zest. Outside, the September rain had started, the real Vancouver rain. The kind that would be here until spring. And the kitchen windows had fogged at the edges with warmth, and somewhere in the living room Miles had apparently located the dinosaur bin Graham had mentioned months ago in a grocery store, and the sounds of a thorough taxonomical inventory had begun. Inside, everything was warm and slightly flowery and a little too loud. It was, Dorothea thought, exactly enough.